Story 1. In the quiet town of Waukesha, Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Ware, lured their friend Peyton Lutner into the woods. They claimed they were going to play a game of hide-and-seek, but they had a more sinister plan in mind. The girls were obsessed with a fictional character known as the Slender Man, a faceless entity with long arms and tentacles that preys on children. They believed that by sacrificing their friend to the Slender Man, they would become his loyal servants. As Peyton played along, Morgan and Anissa attacked her, stabbing her 19 times with a kitchen knife. They left her to die in the woods, but miraculously, she managed to crawl to a nearby road, where a cyclist found her and called for help. Peyton survived the attack, but she was left with physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. Morgan and Anissa were arrested and charged with attempted murder. During their trial, it was revealed that Morgan and Anissa had been planning the attack for months. They had created a secret shrine to the Slender Man in the woods, where they believed he lived. They also had a plan to escape to his mansion in the forest, where they would live with him forever. The girls were found guilty, but were not sentenced to prison due to their young age. Instead, they were sent to mental institutions for treatment. Anissa was found to be mentally ill and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, while Morgan was diagnosed with a personality disorder and a delusional disorder. Despite the verdict, many people in Waukesha and around the world are still afraid of the Slender Man. They believe that he is real and that he is lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim his next victim. Some say they have seen him in the woods at night, his long arms reaching out to snatch unsuspecting children. Others claim to have heard his whispers in their ears, urging them to do his bidding. The legend of the Slender Man lives on, a haunting reminder of the dark and twisted fantasies that can take hold of young minds. And as the sun sets over Waukesha, the townspeople keep a wary eye out for any signs of the faceless entity that still haunts their streets. Story 2. Jeff the Killer had always been a force to be reckoned with. With his pale skin and sinister grin, he was a true nightmare come to life. He had terrorized countless victims, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. But one day, Jeff received a challenge from a mysterious figure known as Slenderman. Slenderman was said to be a faceless entity with long, slender arms that could stretch out to impossible lengths. He was rumored to live in the woods, where he preyed on unsuspecting travelers. Jeff was intrigued by the challenge and decided to accept. He ventured deep into the forest, where he knew Slenderman was waiting for him. As Jeff walked deeper into the woods, he began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. He could sense that he was not alone and that something was watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, he heard a rustling in the trees above him. He looked up and saw Slenderman perched on a branch, his long arms reaching out to grab Jeff. Jeff reacted quickly, pulling out his knife and charging at Slenderman. The two creatures clashed in a vicious battle, their screams echoing through the forest. For hours they fought, neither gaining the upper hand. They slashed and stabbed at each other with their weapons, until finally, Jeff landed a fatal blow. Slenderman fell to the ground, his long arms twitching as he gasped for air. Jeff stood over him, grinning triumphantly as he watched Slenderman breathe his last breath. But as Jeff turned to leave the forest, he realized that he had made a grave mistake. Slenderman was not dead, but merely wounded. He rose up from the ground, his arms extending to impossible lengths. Jeff tried to run, but it was too late. Slenderman caught him with his tentacles, pulling him close and staring into his eyes with his featureless face. Jeff screamed in terror as Slenderman began to consume him, absorbing him into his own twisted body. And as the last of Jeff disappeared into Slenderman's form, the forest fell silent once more. From that day on, the legend of Jeff the Killer and Slenderman spread far and wide. Some said that the two creatures still battled in the woods, locked in an eternal struggle for supremacy. Others whispered that Jeff had become a part of Slenderman, doomed to live out eternity as a part of his grotesque form. But no one knew for sure what had happened to the two creatures that fateful day in the forest. All they knew was that something dark and terrifying was lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim its next victim. Story 3. It was a dark and stormy night when Emily first encountered Slenderwoman. She was driving home from a late shift at work when she took a wrong turn and ended up lost in the woods. As she drove deeper into the forest, she began to feel a sense of unease. The trees loomed overhead like giant sentinels, their branches reaching out to snag at her car. The rain pounded against the roof, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was tall and slender, with long, flowing hair that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. Emily tried to reverse her car, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped, with nowhere to go. The figure approached the car, its face hidden behind a veil of hair. Emily could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see them. Suddenly, the car door opened and the figure climbed in. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen in terror as the figure leaned in close. "Hello, Emily," the figure whispered. "I've been waiting for you." Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and then everything went black. When she woke up, she was in a strange room with no windows. The walls were covered in strange symbols and the air was thick with the smell of incense. Slenderwoman was there, watching her with her featureless face. Emily tried to scream, but her voice was still gone. Slenderwoman spoke to her, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I have chosen you, Emily," she said. "You are special. You have the power to see the truth." Emily didn't understand what she meant. All she knew was that she was trapped, with no way out. Days turned into weeks, and Emily was never allowed to leave the room. Slenderwoman brought her food and water, but never spoke to her except to utter cryptic phrases. Emily began to have strange visions. She saw things that she couldn't explain, things that no one else could see. She saw Slenderwoman's minions, faceless creatures that scuttled around in the darkness. She saw the future, too. She saw the end of the world, a bleak and desolate wasteland where nothing lived. And always, she saw Slenderwoman, watching her with her featureless face. One day, Emily realized that Slenderwoman was draining her of her life force. She was growing weaker and weaker, and knew that she had to escape before it was too late. She waited until Slenderwoman brought her food, and then attacked her with a fork. Slenderwoman was caught off guard, and Emily was able to escape. She ran through the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Slenderwoman's minions chasing her, their skittering footsteps echoing through the trees. Just when she thought she was safe, she heard a voice behind her. "Hello, Emily," Slenderwoman said. Emily turned around and saw Slenderwoman, her long hair blowing in the wind. She was surrounded by her minions, their faceless bodies twitching in anticipation. Emily knew that she was doomed. She had no chance against Slenderwoman and her minions. But then something strange happened. Emily felt a surge of power inside as she gazed upon the helpless figure lying before her. She had always felt like an outsider, like she didn't belong in this world. But now, with this newfound strength coursing through her veins, she knew that she was different in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The figure on the ground was a man she had met at the bar earlier that night. He had seemed nice enough at first, but as the night wore on, his true colors began to show. He had become aggressive and forceful, trying to drag her out of the bar against her will. Emily had fought back, But she quickly realized that physical strength alone was not enough to protect herself. That's when she discovered her gift. As she stood over the man, Emily felt a rush of energy flowing out of her fingertips. She could feel the man's life force being drained away, leaving him weak and helpless on the ground. It was both terrifying and thrilling at the same time. Emily had always felt like she was missing something in her life, like she was meant for something greater. And now, she knew what that something was. But as she stood there, basking in the power of her gift, she began to realize the true cost of her newfound strength. She had taken a life, and there was no going back from that. Emily knew that she could never tell anyone about what had happened. She would be branded a monster, a freak of nature. But as she turned to leave the alleyway, she couldn't help but wonder what other powers lay hidden within her, waiting to be unleashed. The night air was cold and damp as she made her way home, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had done. Emily knew that her life would never be the same again, that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But even as she wrestled with her guilt and shame, a part of her couldn't help but revel in the feeling of power that still lingered within her. She had tasted the forbidden fruit of ultimate power, and there was no going back. Story 4. The woods were dark and foreboding, with the twisted branches of trees reaching towards the night sky like bony fingers. It was in these woods that a group of friends went camping, seeking adventure and excitement. They huddled around the campfire, telling ghost stories to scare each other. As the night grew darker, the group started to hear strange noises coming from the woods. They tried to ignore them, but the noises grew louder and closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall and thin with impossibly long arms. It was Slender Man. The group panicked and ran, but Slender Man pursued them relentlessly. They could hear his footsteps pounding the ground behind them, his breathing hot on their necks. They stumbled and fell, but they kept running. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods and emerged into a clearing. They turned to face Slender Man, ready to fight or flee, but to their surprise, he simply vanished into thin air. Confused and shaken, the group returned to their campsite, determined to leave the woods as soon as possible. As they packed up their gear, they heard a strange sound coming from the trees. It was a soft, eerie humming, like the sound of 1,000 voices singing in unison. The group froze, staring at the woods in terror. Suddenly, the humming grew louder and more intense, until it was almost deafening. The group clapped their hands over their ears, but it did no good. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The group breathed a sigh of relief and hurriedly finished packing up their gear. As they left the woods, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them. They looked back over their shoulders, but there was nothing there. They tried to convince themselves that it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them, but deep down, they knew that they had encountered something truly terrifying. As the group drove away from the woods, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. They were safe, at least for now. But little did they know that Slender Man was not the only monster lurking in those dark woods. There were other creatures, far more sinister and deadly, waiting for their next victims. The group never returned to those woods, and they never spoke of their encounter with Slender Man again. But the memory of that night would haunt them forever, a reminder of the terrifying things that can exist in the darkness. Story 5. The woods were dark and foreboding, with the twisted branches of trees reaching towards the night sky like bony fingers. It was in these woods that a group of friends went camping, seeking adventure and excitement. They huddled around the campfire, telling ghost stories to scare each other. As the night grew darker, the group started to hear strange noises coming from the woods. They tried to ignore them, but the noises grew louder and closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, tall and thin with impossibly long arms. It was Slender Man. The group panicked and ran, but Slender Man pursued them relentlessly. They could hear his footsteps pounding the ground behind them, his breathing hot on their necks. They stumbled and fell, but they kept running. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods and emerged into a clearing. They turned to face Slender Man, ready to fight or flee, but to their surprise, he simply vanished into thin air. Confused and shaken, the group returned to their campsite, determined to leave the woods as soon as possible. As they packed up their gear, they heard a strange sound coming from the trees. It was a soft, eerie humming, like the sound of 1,000 voices singing in unison. The group froze, staring at the woods in terror. Suddenly, the humming grew louder and more intense, until it was almost deafening. The group clapped their hands over their ears, but it did no good. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. The group breathed a sigh of relief and hurriedly finished packing up their gear. As they left the woods, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them. They looked back over their shoulders, but there was nothing there. They tried to convince themselves that it was just their imaginations playing tricks on them, but deep down, they knew that they had encountered something truly terrifying. Days passed, and the group tried to forget about their encounter with Slender Man. However, strange things began to happen. They would wake up in the middle of the night to find their belongings scattered around their room, as if someone had been rummaging through their things. They heard strange whispers in the darkness, and sometimes they caught glimpses of a tall, thin figure lurking outside their windows. One night, the group decided to stay up and keep watch. As they sat in silence, they heard a faint tapping at the window. They crept towards it, heartbeats pounding in their chests, and peered outside. There, standing in the darkness, was Slender Man. He stared at them with his soulless, black eyes, and a feeling of dread washed over the group. They knew that they were in grave danger. Suddenly, Slender Man reached through the window, his impossibly long arms snaking towards them like tendrils of smoke. The group screamed and ran, but Slender Man was too fast. He caught them one by one, dragging them into the darkness. The sounds of their screams echoed through the night, but no one came to help. Slender Man had claimed his victims. In the end, the woods were silent once more. Slender Man had returned to his dark lair, ready to claim new victims. The group's fate was sealed, and their memories were forever haunted by the terrifying encounter with the Slender Man. Terrifying encounter with the Slender Man. Terrifying encounter with the Slender Man.